A single sheet of paper once held the power to redirect history. This is the story of a trade route that moved more than goods. It moved the very foundation of civilization. By the end, you will understand how a simple innovation from a desert workshop reshaped empires and set the stage for our modern world. We will trace its secret journey from the guarded courts of ancient China through the intellectual explosion of the Islamic Golden Age to the heart of medieval Europe. How did this fragile material outlast stone and parchment to become the silent engine of power? The answer lies in a forgotten network of merchants, scholars, and artisans. What does the most ordinary object on your desk tell you about the rise and fall of empires? That quiet pressure built for centuries, a gentle demand for something better. To understand the revolution paper would bring, you must first feel the weight of the world before it. Knowledge was not light, it was heavy. In the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia, scribes worked with damp clay, pressing wedge-shaped marks with a reed stylus to record laws, trades, and epic stories. Once baked, these tablets were nearly indestructible, but imagine a library not of shelves, but of rooms filled with thousands of these stone-like slabs. Moving information meant moving literal weight. It was permanent, yes, but it was also confined by its own physical form. Along the Nile, a different solution grew. The Egyptians mastered papyrus, peeling and layering the stalks of a water reed to create smooth, flexible sheets. This was a leap forward, lighter and far more portable. For a time, it fueled an administrative empire, but papyrus had a geographic lock. It could only be made from the reeds of the Nile Delta. Its production was a local secret, a monopoly of place. If you were not connected to that one river, you were disconnected from this key technology. In the writing halls of medieval Europe, the chosen medium was parchment, crafted from prepared animal skins. The process was intense, involving soaking, scraping, and stretching each hide under tension. The result was superb, durable, and could be written on both sides. But the cost was staggering. A single large Bible might require the prepared skins from a very large number of animals. This made every book a monumental investment, a treasure kept in monastery vaults or royal collections. Literacy and record-keeping became the exclusive domain of the church and the crown, not because of law, but because of sheer economics. The medium itself enforced a hierarchy of knowledge. Each of these materials, clay, papyrus, parchment, shaped the civilization it served. They dictated who could write, what could be recorded, and how far ideas could travel. They created societies where memory was expensive and control over information was control over power. The quest for a writing surface that was at once durable, lightweight, scalable, and affordable was more than a technical challenge. It was a cultural bottleneck, a brake on human progress, and as empires grew and trade routes stretched, this bottleneck tightened. The stage was set not in the palaces of kings, but in a humble workshop far to the east for a discovery that would change the very substance of thought. The solution emerged from a workshop, not a palace. Deep within the eastern Han court, an official named Kai Lun is traditionally credited with presenting a new kind of sheet to the emperor in the year 105. This moment marks a formal recognition, but the story of paper likely began even earlier, with anonymous artisans experimenting in quiet courtyards. Their process was a masterpiece of elegant simplicity. They took the tough inner bark of the mulberry tree, old hemp cloth, and even discarded fishing nets and broke them down in water until the fibers separated. This created a pulpy slurry, a soup of potential. They would then dip a screen of fine bamboo strips into this mixture, lift it out, and let the water drain away. What remained was a delicate, interwoven mat of fibers. Once pressed and dried, it became a sheet that was strong, smooth, and astonishingly light. This was not just an incremental improvement, it was a complete reimagining of the written word's foundation. Before paper, important documents in China were inscribed on heavy bamboo slips tied together with cords, or painted on luxurious but prohibitively expensive silk. Paper shattered those limitations. It was far cheaper to produce than silk and infinitely more portable than a bundle of bamboo. A scholar could now carry an entire library in a single satchel. A government official could dispatch orders and records across the empire without the burden of weight. The very substance of communication had been transformed from a treasure into a tool. Initially, this remarkable new material found humble uses, wrapping precious objects or padding armor, but its destiny was always written upon its surface. Once its capacity for holding ink was realized, a cultural explosion followed. Bureaucracy became more efficient, poetry could flow more freely from brush to sheet, and perhaps most significantly, the sacred texts of Buddhism found a perfect medium for their rapid copying and dissemination. Paper became the bloodstream of Chinese civilization, carrying administration, art, and faith to every corner of the realm. Understanding its immense value, the imperial court guarded the secret of papermaking as a state treasure. For centuries, the knowledge was protected as fiercely as any military secret or royal recipe. This was a technological advantage that conferred soft power, control over information, and cultural prestige. The empire that held the secret of paper held a key to its own enduring legacy, but knowledge, especially knowledge this powerful, has a stubborn tendency to travel. It would not stay behind the Great Wall forever. Its journey westward would begin through the movement of people and ideas, along the very trade routes that connected the distant corners of the ancient world. A secret can only be contained for so long when it travels on the wind. For centuries, the Chinese Empire's monopoly on paper was absolute, a guarded treasure protected by distance and imperial decree. Yet the very networks that carried silk and spices westward, the legendary Silk Road, were destined to become its undoing. This was not a single dusty path, but a sprawling web of interconnected routes, a nervous system for the ancient world that transmitted ideas as readily as it did material goods. It functioned as a kind of primitive internet where a new philosophy, a mathematical concept, or a manufacturing technique could travel from one civilization to another, carried in the minds of merchants, scholars, and travelers of all kinds. The turning point arrived with a shift in the balance of power in Central Asia. In the year 751, near the river Talas, the expanding forces of the Arab Abbasid Caliphate met the armies of China's Tang dynasty. This encounter's most enduring legacy was an unexpected prize of knowledge. Among those who came into contact with the Abbasid forces were skilled Chinese artisans, including experts in the art of papermaking. Recognizing its immense value, the Abbasids welcomed this expertise. They invited these craftsmen to the vibrant city of Samarkand, a glittering jewel on the Silk Road. Here, with access to the region's abundant flax and hemp, these artisans established the very first paper mill outside of East Asia. This was not a simple act of replication. It was a moment of profound technological transfer, a silent pivot in history where a core innovation moved from one civilization's grasp and into the hands of another. The secret was out, and it now belonged to a culture poised to perfect it and spread it across the known world. The Islamic Golden Age, with its thirst for knowledge and its vast, unified trade networks stretching from Central Asia to Spain, would not merely adopt paper, it would transform it into the fuel for an intellectual revolution. Samarkand possessed the perfect recipe for a revolution. It was more than just a stop on the Silk Road. It was a crucible where geography, resources, and ambition converged. The clear, fast-flowing waters of the Zarafshan River provided the essential power and pure water needed to wash and process fibers. The surrounding lands were rich with flax and hemp, offering a robust and renewable raw material far more accessible than the mulberry bark used in China. And most crucially, this city was a beating heart within the Abbasid Caliphate, a civilization with an insatiable appetite for recording, calculating, and preserving knowledge. Papermaking here was not just adopted, it was re-engineered for a new age. Islamic artisans looked at the Chinese method and asked how it could be better. Their key innovation was a process called sizing. They began coating the finished sheets with a thin starch paste, often made from wheat. This might sound like a minor step, but its effect was transformative. The starch filled the tiny pores between the plant fibers, creating a smoother, more uniform surface. Ink no longer bled or feathered uncontrollably. It sat crisply on the page, allowing for finer script and more intricate calligraphy. It also made the paper itself more durable and resistant to handling. The result was a product of legendary quality, Samarkand paper, celebrated across the Islamic world for its remarkable whiteness, its velvety texture, and its enduring strength. This was no longer just a writing material, it was a premium good. The city's workshops buzzed with activity, their output feeding a booming market. Paper became a lucrative trade commodity in its own right, shipped along caravan routes to satisfy the demands of a vast and growing bureaucratic state and an exploding scholarly community. The success of Samarkand proved a vital point. Paper was not just a tool for power, it was also a clear path to profit. This commercial reality would become the engine that propelled the technology relentlessly westward, from one city to the next, each new mill a beacon of innovation in the long story of written communication. This new paper was the physical foundation for a revolution of the mind. In the new capital of Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs built more than a palace. They built an idea made of stone and scrolls, the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Imagine a vast library, a translation bureau, and a research academy all fused into one luminous institution. Its mission was breathtaking in its ambition, to gather all the world's knowledge under one roof. Scholars were commissioned to seek out texts from every known civilization, from the philosophical works of ancient Greece to the medical treatises of Persia and the mathematical marvels of India. They brought back these treasures written on fragile papyrus or costly parchment and faced the monumental task of preserving them for the future. This is where the quiet miracle of Samarkand paper became the loud engine of history. Paper, now affordable and produced in steady quantities, enabled the mass copying of these texts into Arabic. Teams of scribes could work simultaneously, transforming a single rare manuscript into dozens, then hundreds, of identical paper copies. Knowledge was no longer a solitary, fragile flame in a distant library. It was a wildfire that could be intentionally spread. The impact was an intellectual explosion that reshaped the world. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy, which might have faded from memory, were translated, studied, debated, and expanded upon. But this was not mere preservation, it was a dynamic synthesis. Scholars used this newly accessible foundation to make staggering leaps of their own. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, working with Indian numerical systems, systematized algebra and gave his name to the very concept of the algorithm. The physician Al-Razi compiled vast medical encyclopedias that became standard texts for centuries. Because their works were copied onto paper, they did not remain confined to Baghdad. These ideas traveled with merchants and pilgrims along secure trade routes, carried in saddlebags as lightweight bundles of folios. A scholar in Cordoba, Spain, could be studying a commentary written in Cairo, which was itself a discussion of a text translated from Greek in Baghdad. For the first time, a shared intellectual conversation spanned continents, from the markets of Damascus to the libraries of Toledo. This vast, interconnected realm of thought, the Islamic Golden Age, was not held together by armies alone, but by the humble, resilient glue of the paper page. The medium had finally become a true partner to the message, enabling an era where the accumulation of knowledge could outpace its erosion. And as this paper-based network of learning reached the edges of the Islamic world, it would inevitably brush against a continent still writing its future on skins. The knowledge of paper was a wave that could not be contained by any single empire. From the bustling mills of Baghdad and Damascus, the technology rippled steadily along the southern Mediterranean coast, following the well-worn paths of trade and cultural exchange. It arrived in Egypt by the 10th century, where a fascinating historical turn unfolded. The Nile Valley, once the sole source of papyrus, now proved to be an even more perfect home for its successor. The dry, stable climate was ideal for the steady production and drying of paper sheets, and soon the city of Cairo became a major hub, its workshops supplying the administrative needs of the Fatimid Caliphate. This westward drift continued for another 2 centuries, carried by merchants, artisans, and scholars. The technology crossed the sea to Islamic Sicily, a vibrant cultural crossroads, and more significantly, into the heart of Al-Andalus Muslim Spain. It was here, in the verdant hills of the Iberian Peninsula, that paper found a new and powerful European home. In the town of Zátiva, near Valencia, some of the continent's first documented paper mills were established. Locals called them Molinos de la Ploma, mills of the scroll, and they represented a crucial technological leap. These were not small, artisanal workshops. They harnessed the power of flowing water to drive heavy trip hammers, wooden mallets that rose and fell with a steady rhythm, mechanically pounding rags and fibers into a fine, consistent pulp. This was industrialization on a medieval scale, a method that dramatically increased output and lowered cost. This mechanized production in Al-Andalus created something unprecedented for Europe, a reliable and direct supply line. For the Christian kingdoms slowly expanding southward, paper was no longer a mysterious luxury from a distant land. It was a tangible commodity, available in markets and trading posts. Merchants from the Italian maritime republics like Genoa and Venice, who had long traded in the Mediterranean, began to carry bundles of this strong, smooth Spanish paper back to their home cities. So, through both cultural contact and commerce, paper quietly entered a continent whose intellectual life was still etched onto the skin of animals. The stage was now set for a profound meeting of ideas. A society built on the economics of scarcity, where a single book represented a vast investment of resources, was about to meet a technology of growing abundance. The steady hum of the water mills in Zátiva was the sound of a constraint beginning to loosen, a whisper that would soon become a defining conversation in the scriptoriums and rising universities of medieval Europe. Paper arrived in Europe bearing the invisible mark of the unfamiliar. To the learned clergy in their stone scriptoriums and the royal clerks in their chancery offices, this smooth white sheet was not a blank slate, but a foreign import, a product from distant lands. It came from the world of Islam, carried by merchants from regions viewed with both fascination and tension. This origin story mattered deeply. How could a material born outside Christendom be trusted to bear the unchanging word of God or the eternal laws of a king? Parchment made from the skin of animals felt organic, substantial, and permanent. It had a tangible heft that seemed to match the gravity of the truths it carried. A legal charter on parchment was a physical object of authority, one that could endure for centuries. Paper, by contrast, seemed alarmingly fragile. A woven plant substance that could tear, could be damaged by damp, and worse, could burn. Its perceived impermanence made it seem unworthy for anything of lasting importance. This was not just a preference, it became a matter of official policy. In the year 1221, a papal decree explicitly forbade the use of paper for the official registers of the papacy. Sacred and legal permanence would remain the domain of animal skin. This resistance was also deeply economic. The production of parchment supported a vast and established network, from the tanners and parchment makers to the scribes whose entire craft was calibrated for that specific surface. Guilds protected these trades, and their methods were intertwined with the social and economic order. Paper threatened that entire ecosystem. Yet, for all this powerful resistance, paper possessed a single, undeniable virtue that parchment could never match: affordability. While a single sheet of fine parchment represented the processed skin of a calf or a sheep, a sheet of paper represented some old linen rags, some hemp, and water. The cost difference was not marginal, it was revolutionary. And so, a quiet, pragmatic invasion began in the back offices of history. Kings and merchants might decree that their final treaties be on parchment, but the countless drafts, the calculations, the trial versions, and the personal letters that led to those treaties were increasingly written on cheap paper. It became the thinking medium, the disposable notepad of an emerging bureaucratic world. Account books for bustling Italian trading houses began to be kept on paper ledgers, simply because the volume of transactions would have been impossibly expensive to record on skins. Scholars and students who could never afford a parchment copy of a text could now access paper copies of lectures and commentaries. This gradual, bottom-up acceptance was a classic tale of utility defeating tradition. People first used paper for things that did not matter officially, only to discover that these very things, the drafts, the accounts, the personal correspondence, were actually the lifeblood of commerce, governance, and intellectual exchange. The stage was now set for a collision. On one side stood a centuries-old system of knowledge built on scarcity, prestige, and controlled access, physically embodied in the weighty parchment codex. On the other side was a new technology of abundance, a lightweight, affordable medium that was already proving its worth in the shadows of official power. All it would take was one more invention to bring these two forces into direct, world-altering conflict. A machine that could marry the power of the printed word with the economics of the paper page. The true revolution of paper was measured not in ink but in coin. To understand its world-altering impact, you must look past the scholars and toward the merchants, the bankers, and the bustling town halls. Its greatest power was an economic one. Consider the sheer physical cost of the old world. Producing a single complete Bible on fine parchment required the prepared skins of approximately 250 sheep. This represented a staggering investment of land, labor, and livestock. A book was not just a container for ideas, it was a literal treasury, a store of capital locked in a form only the wealthiest institutions could afford. Paper shattered this equation. Its primary ingredient was not a precious animal, but a discarded one: old linen rags, hemp cloth, the worn-out fabric of everyday life. Combined with water and processed in a mechanized mill, these rags were transformed into a clean, uniform sheet at a fraction of the cost. This was not a slight discount, it was an exponential reduction in the price of a page. This new affordability triggered a cascade of practical changes that reshaped society from the ground up. For the first time, meticulous, permanent record-keeping became feasible outside the walls of a monastery or a royal chancery. A merchant running a bustling import business could now maintain detailed ledgers, tracking every shipment, every debt, and every profit across dozens of pages without facing financial ruin. Contracts between trading partners could be drafted, copied, and archived, creating a new layer of legal security and trust in business dealings. In growing towns, civic governments began to keep systematic records, birth registries, property deeds, and council minutes, all on affordable paper. This created an institutional memory for communities, a written backbone for law and administration that did not rely solely on fragile human recollection. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in the rising financial centers of Renaissance Italy. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, the first modern banks were taking shape. Their entire business model, which involved lending money, transferring funds across great distances, and managing complex investments, was utterly dependent on the paper trail. They relied on bills of exchange, a revolutionary paper instrument that allowed a merchant in Venice to carry a letter of credit to a trade fair in Champagne, effectively moving vast sums without the peril of transporting chests of gold. Double-entry bookkeeping, the system that gave a clear picture of profit and loss, was born in this environment, its neat columns of numbers sprawling across paper ledgers. This was not possible with parchment. The volume of transactions would have been physically and financially impossible to record. Paper quietly became the indispensable bloodstream of commerce. It enabled the rise of a new, literate merchant class whose power was based on financial acumen recorded in ink, not just land ownership recorded in feudal ledgers. It facilitated a more sophisticated, documented, and interconnected economy that could span continents. This reliable flow of information and credit underpinned the explosive growth of cities, funded grand explorations, and provided the administrative tools necessary for the early modern state to govern its people and collect its taxes. The humble rag had become the foundation of fortune, proving that the most profound revolutions often begin with a simple change in the cost of doing business. But literacy is a skill, not just a material. The flood of affordable paper created a powerful new demand, not for more books but for more writers. In the shadow of cathedral walls, a quiet professional revolution was taking shape. The Scriptorium, once the sole sanctuary of the written word, now faced competition from the open market. A new figure appeared in the bustling squares of growing towns, the secular scribe. This was not a monk seeking spiritual merit through copying, but a lay professional offering a paid service. You would find them at wooden desks in market stalls or in small shops, their tools a sharpened quill, a pot of ink, and most importantly, a fresh stack of paper. Their work was the practical paperwork of daily life. They drafted legal agreements for merchants forming a new partnership. They wrote letters for a trader sending instructions to a supplier in another city. They recorded the final instructions of a wealthy merchant, ensuring his legacy passed to his family according to his wishes. For a fee, they gave written form to human agreements, memories, and ambitions. This was a profound shift in the ecology of knowledge. For centuries, the Church had acted as the primary gatekeeper and mediator of the written word. Sacred texts, legal codes, and historical records were filtered through its institutions. Now, writing was becoming a trade. Guilds of scribes and notaries formed, establishing standards for scripts, formats, and authentication. Their seal gave a document legal weight, a civic authority that stood alongside, and sometimes apart from, ecclesiastical authority. A contract between two merchants was validated by the scribe's professional reputation and the town's laws, not by a bishop's blessing. The implications rippled through society. Law and commerce began to develop their own written traditions, their own paper trails, independent of religious oversight. A merchant's account book was a testament to his own worldly dealings, not a spiritual ledger. A personal letter carried private thoughts across distances, creating networks of communication that operated outside official channels. The secular scribe, therefore, was far more than a copyist. They were a key agent in a slow, monumental transition. By making the practical tools of literacy available to anyone who could pay their fee, they helped shift the axis of daily life. The world was gradually moving from one where ultimate explanations and authorities were divinely oriented, to one where human agreements, recorded on affordable paper, could build cities, govern trade, and shape individual destiny. The page was no longer just a vessel for eternal truths. It was becoming a blueprint for a self-made future. Yet for all its power to spread the written word, paper was still a medium copied by hand, one painstaking page at a time. This was the final bottleneck, and its solution would emerge from a fusion of existing ideas. The concept of printing with movable letters was not a European invention. Centuries before Gutenberg, artisans in Song Dynasty China had perfected the use of carved wooden blocks to print entire pages of text. Later, the brilliant innovator Bai Sheng created movable type from baked clay. This was a stunning technological leap, yet it did not ignite a printing revolution across East Asia in the same way. The reason lies in the beautiful complexity of character-based languages, where thousands of unique symbols are needed to convey meaning. Rearranging a vast set of fragile clay characters for each new page was a monumental logistical challenge, often slower than skilled block carving. Furthermore, the social and scholarly structures of the time, centered on a bureaucratic elite, did not create the same explosive commercial demand for mass-produced texts that would later emerge in Europe. By the 15th century, the conditions in the West had become a perfect storm. There was a growing, restless audience hungry for knowledge, a class of merchants and professionals who saw the value in books but could not afford the price of a scribe's labor. There was a rising tide of intellectual and religious debate that craved a faster way to spread ideas. And most crucially, there was now a cheap, uniform, and readily available substrate, paper, produced in mills across the continent. Without it, the next great invention would have remained a fascinating curiosity. In the German city of Mainz, around the year 1450, Johannes Gutenberg brought all these threads together. His genius was not in a single flash of inspiration, but in a systematic engineering solution. He adapted a wine press to apply even pressure. He developed a method for casting durable, reusable metal type from a lead-based alloy, creating a full alphabet of identical letters. And he formulated a thick, oil-based ink that would adhere cleanly to metal and transfer sharply to the page. But his entire enterprise, his investment in type and press, was a financial calculation that only made sense with paper. Imagine trying to print his famous Bible on parchment. Each irregular, costly sheet would have required precise alignment and immense care, and the staggering number of animal skins needed would have made a single copy impossibly expensive. The press's economic power came from its ability to run sheet after identical sheet of affordable paper, turning a single setting of type into hundreds of perfect copies. This is what transformed the printing press from a novel machine into a world-altering force. The first major printed work was fittingly a Bible, a book of profound spiritual authority now produced with mechanical precision. But the press quickly turned to more immediate concerns. It printed official documents, including letters pertaining to religious practice, by the thousands. And perhaps most dynamically, it began to produce pamphlets and broadsheets, short, timely texts on everything from philosophical debates to news of discoveries and satirical commentaries. For the first time in history, a complex idea could be captured on a Tuesday in Mainz, and by the end of the month, hundreds of identical copies could be sparking conversations in markets and taverns across the region. The age of mass communication had dawned, not because of the press alone, but because the press finally had a material partner that could keep pace with its revolutionary speed. The silent, resilient sheet of paper had become the vessel for a new kind of lightning. The printing press did not emerge into a vacuum of silence. For 200 years before Gutenberg's workshop, the intellectual landscape of Europe was already humming with a new energy, a rising tide of words made possible by paper. This was the age of the manuscript boom, a period often overshadowed by what came next, but which laid the essential groundwork for the revolution to follow. Books were still copied entirely by hand, letter by letter, yet something profound had shifted. They were no longer rare treasures locked away. They were becoming tools, commodities, and vessels for a rapidly connecting world of thought. The engine of this change was the commercial scriptorium. In bustling university towns like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, a new kind of workshop appeared. These were not quiet cloisters but busy, for-profit enterprises. They operated like small factories of knowledge, employing specialized teams. Scribes, often university students earning their keep, worked in rows, their quills scratching across stacks of paper folios. Rubricators followed, adding chapter headings and key passages in distinctive red ink, a visual guide for the reader. Finally, illuminators might embellish important texts with intricate borders and miniature illustrations, though for most books this costly step was omitted. The focus was on volume, clarity, and speed. Their primary output was practical, textbooks on law, medicine, and theology for students, copies of newly rediscovered classical works, and commentaries by contemporary scholars. This system dramatically increased the velocity of ideas. Before paper, a scholar's new commentary might take years to be copied onto a handful of precious parchment volumes, likely remaining within a single library. Now, a commercial scriptorium could produce dozens of paper copies in a matter of months. These lighter, more affordable books could be carried by traveling scholars, sold at book fairs, or sent as gifts between courts. The ideas of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or the recovered texts of ancient Greek philosophers began to circulate through academic networks with an unprecedented pace and geographic reach. A debate sparked in Paris could be referenced and challenged in Bologna within a season, creating a truly continental conversation. This era was not a dark age of scarcity waiting for a mechanical savior. It was a vibrant, accelerating prelude. The commercial scriptoria were creating both the supply and the demand. They were building a growing audience of literate professionals, students, and nobles who owned and expected to own books. More crucially, they were creating the very textual corpus, the standardized versions of major works, that the printing press would later reproduce by the thousand. The manuscript boom proved there was a hungry market for the written word. It established the distribution networks and the cultural habit of seeking knowledge in a portable, personal codex. When the first metal type was finally inked and pressed onto a sheet of paper, it was not speaking to an empty room. It was amplifying a conversation that was already rising in volume, ready to be heard by the world. Power flows through the hands of the bureaucrat as surely as through the sword of the knight. As the late medieval world grew more complex, kings and princes faced a fundamental challenge. How could they rule a sprawling realm not through personal loyalty to a local lord, but through a unified, consistent system that answered to the crown? The old feudal order, built on oaths and land grants, was a patchwork of personal agreements. To centralize authority, a ruler needed something new, a system of impersonal, documented control. The instrument of this quiet revolution was not a new weapon, but a new filing cabinet. Paper became the essential tool for building the modern state. The ambitions were grand, but the mechanics were mundane. A king could not personally collect every tax or adjudicate every dispute in a distant village. He needed a way to see his kingdom, to make its people and its wealth legible from the throne room. This required an explosion of documentation. Laws could no longer be proclaimed and then left to local interpretation. They needed to be written down, copied, and distributed to officials across the land, ensuring everyone answered to the same code. Tax collection transformed from a rough estimate negotiated with local barons into a systematic process. Officials used paper to create censuses, land surveys, and detailed rolls of ownership and obligation. The famous Domesday Book of 11th century England was a monumental parchment precursor, a snapshot of a kingdom newly organized. With paper, such surveys could become routine, updated records that turned a collection of territories into a manageable, measurable entity. To handle this flood of documents, the royal chancery, once a small clerical office, ballooned into a true bureaucracy. Scribes worked in shifts, drafting proclamations, copying legal judgments, and recording correspondence. For the first time, governments began to create official archives, rooms filled with chests and shelves where past decrees and legal precedents were stored for reference. This was a profound shift. Authority was no longer just the spoken word of a monarch, which could be disputed or forgotten. It was now a physical paper trail, a permanent record that could be consulted and verified. A decision made by a king's judge 10 years prior could be pulled from a file to justify a ruling today, creating a continuous thread of institutional law. The Italian city-states, masters of commerce, became pioneers of this paper-based governance. The Venetian Republic, a maritime empire scattered across the Mediterranean, ran its affairs with breathtaking administrative precision. Its elaborate councils kept meticulous minutes. Every ship's cargo, every diplomatic envoy's report, every expenditure on public works was recorded, filed, and cross-referenced. Governance became a science of documentation, allowing a small group of officials to manage a far-flung network of ports and trade routes. This system created a powerful new form of legitimacy. A citizen's rights, a merchant's contract, a community's obligations were not subject to the memory or whim of a local official. They were inscribed on sheets that could be archived and retrieved, creating a sense of impartial, institutional permanence. The state, in essence, began to outlive any single ruler. Its memory and its authority resided not in a person, but in the growing, organized mountain of paper in its archives. The power to write things down, to file them away, and to call them back when needed, had become the silent engine of sovereignty, reshaping the very idea of what it meant to govern. A signature alone was a fragile promise in a world of shifting memory. The true power of the written agreement came not from the pen, but from the public seal of a trusted third party, the notary. This figure, a civic official found in every significant town and city, became the human linchpin of the new paper world. More than a simple scribe, a notary was a legal witness empowered by the state to authenticate documents, to turn private words into public truth. Their profession transformed the texture of daily life, creating a scaffold of trust upon which an increasingly complex society could safely build. The notary's office was a hub of human affairs. With a stack of blank paper folios bound into a register, they recorded the milestones and transactions that defined a community. A couple came to formalize their marriage contract, detailing provisions for the future. A merchant, thinking ahead, dictated his wishes for his enterprise, ensuring his business passed smoothly to his sons. A farmer sold a parcel of land to a neighbor, the exact boundaries and payment terms carefully noted. Every business partnership, every loan agreement, every apprenticeship indenture found its official form under the notary's practiced hand. Each of these acts was more than a record. It was a performative ceremony, a ritual of authentication conducted before a public authority. The notary would listen, draft the document in a formal legal style, have the parties sign or make their mark, and then apply his own unique sign, a combination of a handwritten symbol and an official seal. This act transformed the paper from a personal note into a notarial instrument, a document presumed to be truthful and complete in the eyes of the law. The genius of this system lay in its permanence and its public access. The notary did not simply hand over the original document to the parties involved. He kept the official record, the protocol, in his bound register, stored in a civic archive. This created an indelible, searchable public memory. If a dispute arose years later over the terms of an arrangement or the boundary of a property, one could petition the archive. A clerk would retrieve the notary's original register, find the precise entry, and produce a certified copy. Suddenly, a fading personal recollection or a lost scrap of paper was countered by the cold, official fact of the archived record. This reduced countless conflicts and provided a powerful deterrent against fraud. Your word was only as good as your reputation. but the notary's word was backed by the full force of municipal authority. What made this revolution in trust so pervasive was its affordability. This system of documented security could never have functioned on parchment. The cost of having every shopkeeper's lease or every artisan's partnership agreement drawn up on expensive animal skin would have been prohibitive. Paper brought the notary's services within reach of the emerging middle class, the merchants, the master craftsmen, the successful farmers. For the price of a few coins, they could secure their property, plan for the future, and formalize their business dealings with a level of legal certainty once reserved for nobles and bishops. This web of notarized reality created something profound, a stable framework for risk. Knowing that agreements were enforceable and property rights were documented encouraged investment and long-term planning. It allowed capital to flow more freely, as loans could be secured against clearly recorded assets. It gave individuals a new kind of agency over their lives, allowing them to project their will into the future with confidence. The hum of the notary's quill on paper was the sound of a society learning to trust not just in persons, but in processes, weaving a durable fabric of documented reality that enabled commerce to flourish and communities to grow beyond the scale of personal acquaintance. The true measure of a revolution is not in its grand proclamations, but in its quiet presence on the workbench. While paper was reshaping states and universities, it was also performing 1,000 humble tasks that slowly rewired the rhythms of daily existence. In the apothecary's shop, a healer would carefully fold powdered herbs or medicinal salts into small paper packets, each one labeled with instructions for the patient. This simple act did more than contain a remedy. It externalized memory and precise dosage, allowing complex care to move from the expert's shop into the home. A merchant running a bustling stall no longer had to rely on mental tallies or marks on a wax tablet. He could keep a paper ledger, a permanent list of inventory sold and debts owed, turning the chaos of a market day into a manageable record. This was a new kind of security, a private archive that extended a person's memory and planning across weeks and months. For families of means, paper brought sacred rituals into the private chamber. A beautifully illustrated book of hours, a devotional guide for daily prayers, might now be a paper copy, affordable enough for a prosperous merchant's wife to use in her own home rather than solely in a church. An almanac with its charts of feast days and planting cycles could be consulted at the hearth. These objects personalized faith and timekeeping, making the frameworks of culture and cosmos a direct tactile experience. Perhaps most tellingly, paper became the medium for both planning and play. An artist conceiving a grand altarpiece would first work out the composition in a swift, confident sketch on paper, a freedom impossible on costly parchment or prepared wood. This allowed for experimentation, for mistakes that led to better ideas, and when the work was done, there was leisure. Playing cards, their designs block printed on sturdy paper sheets, arrived from distant lands and spread like wildfire. They were not for the nobility alone, as taverns and homes echoed with the shuffle and play of these new paper games, a testament to the medium's role in casual recreation. Each of these uses, from the wrapped medicine to the sketched idea to the played hand, performed a subtle but profound cultural work. They normalized the presence of the written or printed word in spaces far from the scriptorium. They made literacy and personal record-keeping not an elite privilege, but a practical tool for managing health, business, faith, and even pleasure. Paper was teaching an entire society to think on the page, to trust the note, to see their own lives as something that could be documented, planned, and reflected upon. This widespread, mundane comfort with the medium created a fertile cultural soil, a population increasingly accustomed to interacting with information on a sheet. It was this prepared ground, more than any single invention, that would make the next great leap in human communication not just possible but inevitable. The hum of the water wheel was the sound of a new kind of power reshaping the land. While we often picture paper as a product of quiet contemplation, its production was an early industrial act, a process that left a lasting mark on both the environment and the economy. Those picturesque mills nestled in river valleys were not quaint workshops. They were the factories of their day, often the first mechanized industry to arrive in rural regions. Their need for constant, reliable power led to the construction of weirs, mill races, and dams, deliberately altering the flow of rivers and streams to serve human enterprise. Local hydrology was bent to the will of production, a quiet transformation of the natural landscape to fuel the hunger for the written word. This hunger created a surprising and vital market, one built on urban renewal. Primary ingredient for European paper was not fresh-cut timber but discarded textiles. The demand for clean linen and cotton rags was insatiable, giving birth to an entire profession, the rag collector. These individuals, often from the most humble segments of society, became the essential gatherers of a new raw material. They moved through city streets and country lanes with carts or sacks, calling for rags at every door, purchasing worn-out clothing, old sails, and discarded household linens. This organized system became a circulatory network for the pre-industrial economy, turning what was overlooked into something precious. It created a new value chain that linked every household to a growing network of knowledge, as a worn shirt from a London alley could eventually become part of a ledger in a Venetian bank or a pamphlet in a German university town. The mill itself was a complex ecosystem of skill. Selecting the right site was a science, requiring clean, soft water and a steady fall to turn the great wheel that powered the trip hammers. Inside, a specialized workforce carried out the precise stages of production. The gathered materials were sorted, treated to loosen fibers, then beaten for days by the heavy mechanical hammers into a fine, uniform pulp. The vatman, with his precise, rocking motion, would dip the mold into the slurry to form each sheet, while the courier expertly transferred the wet sheet to a felt blanket. The layers were pressed, then the sheets were hung in vast, airy lofts to dry. Each step required specific knowledge, from preparing the sizing for the paper to finishing the surface with smooth stones. These clusters of skilled workers formed tight-knit industrial communities, their lives and fortunes tied to the rhythm of the mill. The dependencies they created, for materials, for supplies, for tools, were early blueprints for the complex supply chains and manufacturing towns of the centuries to come. The paper on which empires wrote their laws was itself the product of a quiet, widespread, and transformative industrial revolution. But every tool of light can cast a long shadow. The same efficiency that spread Aristotle's philosophy and medical texts could also carry whispers of dissent, ideas that questioned established authority. For every official who saw paper as a means of control, there was another who saw it as a key to a different lock. The church and crown quickly realized this new medium had a dangerous twin, an unparalleled capacity to multiply and distribute challenging knowledge. A controversial thought, once confined to a hushed conversation, could now be captured in ink, copied 100 times on affordable paper, and transported across a kingdom in a merchant's pack. The age of mass communication had also ushered in an age of profound ideological exchange. Authorities responded with deep concern. They established systems requiring printers to obtain official licenses before publication. But the new technology had already been unleashed. One powerful response was the public burning of texts, a spectacle meant to cleanse the community of dangerous ideas. These actions targeted paper volumes with particular intensity, precisely because they were so numerous and so easy to conceal. A ponderous parchment Bible was a singular treasure, difficult to hide. A stack of paper pamphlets, however, could be tucked into a loaf of bread, sewn into a coat lining, or placed inside a barrel of grain. Their very physical nature made them elusive, and therefore, in the eyes of authorities, more troubling. This dynamic fueled some of history's most significant cultural transformations. In England, the followers of John Wycliffe, known as Lollards, used handwritten paper copies of his English translation of the Bible to engage with religious doctrine directly. Possession of such a text could lead to serious consequences, yet the paper copies circulated quietly, read aloud in homes and fields, allowing individuals to explore Scripture for themselves. A century later, Martin Luther's 95 Theses were not just nailed to a church door, they were printed on paper and spread across Germany with astonishing speed, igniting the Protestant Reformation. His later writings and those of his opponents turned the printing press into a battleground of pamphlets, a paper war that reshaped continents. The affordability of paper was its most revolutionary feature for new ideas. It meant that challenging perspectives were no longer the exclusive province of educated elites who could afford rare manuscripts. A critical political pamphlet or a satirical verse could be produced for very little and sold in market squares, read aloud in taverns, and passed from hand to hand until it wore out. This portability allowed ideas to cross borders with ease, hidden among trade goods. A text restricted in Paris could be printed in Geneva and brought back into France, carried by travelers, merchants, or those seeking new understanding. In this way, paper became a quiet partner to cultural change. It broadened access to challenging discourse. It enabled a new kind of intellectual movement, one built not on armed rebellion, but on the widespread, discreet sharing of a different vision for society. The very qualities that made paper perfect for bureaucracy and commerce, its lightness, its low cost, and its ease of duplication, also made it an ideal medium for independent thought and circulating writings. The struggle expanded beyond who controlled the land or the army, to include who influenced the narrative, the story written on a fragile, yet endlessly reproducible sheet. A sheet of paper was never just a blank space waiting for words. It was a physical object with its own hidden language, a texture and character that spoke before a single letter was written. In the hands of skilled artisans, this functional substrate blossomed into a canvas for subtle artistry, revealing how deeply medieval and Renaissance cultures valued the written word itself. The first clue to a paper's identity was often invisible until you held it up to the light. This was the watermark, a delicate design pressed into the wire mesh of the paper-making mold during its creation. To the vatman dipping his mold into the pulp, it was a simple wire shape bent into the screen, but on the finished sheet it appeared as a faint, translucent emblem. A mill might use a simple circle, a cluster of grapes, or the outline of a tower. These were not mere decoration, they were trademarks, silent signatures of quality and origin. A merchant ordering paper from the mills of Fabriano, Italy, would look for its distinctive watermark as a guarantee of the sheet's strength and consistency. Over time, these marks became a language for historians, allowing them to trace the journey of a document or even date an undated manuscript by the style of the watermark used. The paper carried its own story woven into its fibers. The aesthetic possibilities extended far beyond these hidden signatures. Paper could be transformed into a spectacle of color and pattern. Artisans learned to tint entire batches, creating sheets of deep blue, soft green, or rich saffron yellow for special manuscripts or official documents. For the most luxurious in papers of a binding, they developed the art of marbling, floating inks on a thickened solution, and laying the paper atop it to capture swirling, stone-like patterns that were never the same twice. Gold leaf could be applied to the edges of a book's pages so that a closed volume would gleam from the shelf, a treasure of light. The very act of writing contributed to this beauty. The most common ink of the era, iron gall ink, was a chemical partner to the paper's surface. Made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, it went onto the sized paper a deep bluish black. But as it oxidized over time, it matured into the rich, warm brown we associate with old manuscripts. This ink did not simply sit on top of the paper, it bonded with the sized surface, becoming part of the sheet's physical history. A scribe's confident stroke, the slight variation in pressure, the occasional drip or correction, all became part of the artifact's unique character. Finally, the bookbinder would encase these paper folios in a protective shell that was itself a statement. Boards of oak or beech were covered in sturdy leather, tooled with intricate geometric designs, floral patterns, or even scenes stamped into the material. Clasps of brass or silver would hold the volume shut. The binding was armor and ambassador, proclaiming the value of the contents within long before it was opened. This entire journey, from the watermark in the mill to the gold on the edge to the tooling on the cover, reveals a profound truth. Even as paper made the written word more common, the culture never stopped treating it with reverence. The line between a utilitarian object and a work of art was beautifully, intentionally blurred. The container was crafted to be worthy of the thought it held, a final, elegant testament to the idea that knowledge in any form deserved to be housed in something beautiful. Profit was not a feeling but a number waiting to be discovered. In the counting houses of 14th century Italy, amid the clatter of coins and the rustle of trade ledgers, a quiet intellectual revolution was taking shape. It was a revolution in trust, clarity, and control, and its essential tool was a bound paper notebook. The system was called double-entry bookkeeping, and it transformed commerce from a risky gamble into a manageable science. Before its widespread adoption, a merchant's records might be a simple list of expenses and income, a single column that told a vague story. It was easy to see if coins were coming in, but nearly impossible to understand where they were really going, or if apparent wealth was just an illusion built on unpaid debts. The new method demanded 2 entries for every single transaction, a debit and a credit, recorded in separate columns across 2 facing pages. If you sold a shipment of wool, you credited your wool inventory account and debited your cash account. The beauty of the system was its built-in balance. Every transaction kept the ledger in equilibrium, and if the books did not balance at the end of the day, you knew with certainty that an error or a discrepancy lay hidden within the numbers. This was more than arithmetic, it was a philosophy of order imposed upon the chaos of the marketplace. This meticulous practice was utterly dependent on the physical medium of paper. Parchment was too costly and inflexible for the daily blizzard of entries required by a busy trading firm. Paper, however, was affordable and abundant. Merchants used bound paper notebooks called libri, creating permanent chronological records that could be referenced, audited, and analyzed. The famous Medici Bank of Florence, with its branches across Europe, relied on this paper trail to maintain control over its far-flung operations. A manager in London and a manager in Bruges would record their transactions in identical paper ledgers, allowing the head office in Florence to compile a true picture of the entire enterprise's health. For the first time, a business could see itself not as a collection of separate deals, but as a single, interconnected organism. It could distinguish between capital and revenue, between a temporary cash flow problem and a fundamental shift in fortune. It created the concept of a financial position, a snapshot of net worth at a specific moment in time. The system was formally enshrined in the year 1494, when the Franciscan friar and mathematician Luca Pacioli published his comprehensive work, the Summa de Arithmetica. In one chapter, he detailed the method of Venetian bookkeeping, providing the first printed manual for this powerful tool. Pacioli did not invent the practice, but by describing it in a printed book on paper, he standardized and disseminated it across the continent. His treatise made clear that this was not just for shopkeepers, it was the necessary foundation for any rational commercial undertaking. the impact was profound. Double-entry bookkeeping provided the cognitive framework for capitalist enterprise. It enabled the rise of joint stock companies, where investors could trust the audited accounts of a venture they would never see. It created the very possibility of corporate finance and large-scale investment. By demanding a clear, verifiable story of value, it fostered a new economic rationality, a way of thinking about the world in terms of measurable assets and calculated risk. The bound paper ledger, filled with its paired columns of numbers, became the silent engine of the modern commercial world, turning the humble trade in rags and ink into the architecture of global finance. Knowledge requires a place to fail, to be crossed out, and to begin again. The great shift from ancient philosophy to modern science was not a sudden leap of genius, but a slow, methodical dance of trial and error, a process that demanded a forgiving and affordable medium. Aristotle and his medieval followers had built towering systems of thought through pure logic, deducing the nature of the world from first principles. The new thinkers of the 16th and 17th centuries turned this approach on its head. They began not with what must be true, but with what could be observed, measured, and tested. This empirical method, the heart of the scientific revolution, was a conversation conducted almost entirely on paper. Consider the working life of Galileo Galilei. His groundbreaking discoveries about the motion of falling objects and the moons of Jupiter did not spring fully formed from his telescope. They emerged from a messy, iterative paper trail. He would draft a hypothesis in his notebook, a tentative explanation for what he saw. Then he would design an experiment, perhaps rolling balls down an inclined plane, and record columns of measurements, the times and distances, directly onto sheets of paper. These raw numbers were then the subject of calculations, diagrams of trajectories, and pages of analysis where initial ideas were scratched out and refined. Paper was the laboratory for his thoughts, a space where a wrong guess was not a catastrophe, but simply a leaf that could be turned. The cost of parchment would have made this experimental brainstorming prohibitively expensive, stifling the very freedom to be wrong that science required. This same dynamic powered the work of Johannes Kepler as he wrestled with the orbit of Mars, filling thousands of pages with complex geometric calculations in search of the elliptical path, and of Isaac Newton, whose notebooks revealed decades of private speculation on light, motion, and mathematics before his grand syntheses were published. For them, paper was more than a recording tool. It was an extension of their cognitive process, allowing them to hold multiple variables, diagrams, and lines of reasoning in a permanent, reviewable form. Yet science is not a solitary pursuit. A discovery locked in a private notebook changes nothing. The true acceleration came from paper's ability to connect minds across continents. This was the era of the Republic of Letters, an informal network of scholars, scientists, and curious gentlemen who maintained a constant, dense correspondence. A letter from Galileo in Florence, describing his telescopic observations of the phases of Venus, could be copied and sent to colleagues in London, Prague, and Paris within months. These letters were not mere greetings, they were preprint publications, complete with diagrams carefully drawn onto the paper, data tables, and detailed arguments. They invited critique, confirmation, and further questions, creating a collaborative, distributed dialogue that bypassed the slow channels of formal book publishing. This need for a reliable, regular forum for this new knowledge led directly to the birth of the scientific journal. In 1665, the Royal Society of London began publishing its Philosophical Transactions. This periodical, printed on paper and mailed to subscribers across Europe, institutionalized the process of communication. It provided a permanent, citable record of experiments, observations, and debates. Now, when Robert Boyle wrote about his air pump experiments or Antony van Leeuwenhoek described microscopic creatures, their findings entered a stable, cumulative archive. Other researchers could read, attempt to replicate the work, and build directly upon it. Their own contributions added to the next issue. Paper, in the form of the journal, created a scaffolding for knowledge that could grow taller and stronger with each generation. It turned the private, iterative process of the notebook into a public, collaborative edifice, providing the documented, step-by-step foundation upon which the modern world was built. A map drawn on parchment was a declaration, not a tool for discovery. It was a fixed masterpiece, costly to create and impossible to update without starting over. The world it depicted was often a beautiful echo of ancient texts, a static landscape of faith and myth. But when cartography met the paper page, something extraordinary happened. The map became a living document, a work in progress that could keep pace with a world suddenly expanding at the edges. This was the cartographic leap, a shift that transformed how humanity understood and ultimately engaged with the very space around it. The first practical beneficiaries were the sailors of the Mediterranean. Their lives depended on an intimate knowledge of coastlines, currents, and hidden harbors. They used portolan charts, intricate maps dense with radiating lines called room lines that helped plot a course from port to port. Before paper, these were drawn on expensive vellum, unique treasures held by ship captains or wealthy trading families. With paper, they could be copied, revised, and reproduced at a fraction of the cost. A captain could now own a personal chart, annotating it with his own notes on shifting sandbars or favorable anchorages. These updated paper charts were passed from hand to hand, their collective knowledge refining the maritime picture with each voyage. The sea, once a realm of deep mystery, was slowly becoming a documented space. This capacity for revision became the engine of the age of exploration. As Portuguese caravels crept down the African coast and Spanish carracks crossed the Atlantic, they brought back not just spices and gold, but data, crude sketches, and logged coordinates. Cartographers in Lisbon, Seville, and Antwerp waited eagerly for these reports. Armed with stacks of paper, figures like Gerardus Mercator could engage in a dynamic dialogue with the New World. He would draft a new projection of the globe, incorporating reports from a recent voyage. Then a critique would arrive, or a rival map based on different accounts, and he would take up his pen again, adjusting details on one sheet and redrawing coastlines on another. This iterative process, this freedom to refine and correct, was only possible with an affordable, plentiful medium. The final printed world map that emerged from his workshop was not a guess, it was a consensus, a snapshot of the best available knowledge at that precise moment. These paper maps were immediately operational. They were unrolled on the desks of royal advisors planning new ventures, used by generals to plot movements in unfamiliar territories, and studied by merchants calculating the possibilities of new trade routes. A paper map turned the abstract concept of a distant territory into a manageable administrative grid. An official could note boundaries, mark resources, and plan settlements directly on the sheet. It made large-scale coordination a logistical exercise, a matter of lines on a page that could be copied and sent to subordinates across the globe. Perhaps most profoundly, the paper map reshaped the human imagination. For the average person in a European town, the world was their valley, their market, the stories of travelers. A printed paper map, even a simplified one, allowed them to hold the idea of a connected planet in their hands. They could trace a finger along the route from their home port to the Indies, or grasp the vast expanse of an ocean. It shrank psychological distance, making global trade and exploration not just possible but conceivable. The map ceased to be a record of what was known and became a prompt for what might be found, a paper invitation to fill in the remaining blank spaces with names and dreams. A letter could travel faster than a man, but only if the road was ready. As Renaissance states grew, their greatest challenge was not moving armies, but moving information. The solution emerged not from a royal decree alone, but from a partnership between organization and a specific physical object. Across the fractured landscape of the Holy Roman Empire, a family named Thurn und Taxis built something remarkable, a scheduled, reliable postal network. Their couriers, riding in relays between stations spaced a day's ride apart, could carry a message from Brussels to Innsbruck in under a week, a breathtaking speed for the era. This system's very architecture was designed around the properties of paper. A courier's saddlebag could hold hundreds of lightweight paper letters, a volume of communication utterly impossible if each message were a heavy wax tablet or a bulky parchment scroll. Paper turned information into a cargo that could be quantified, bundled, and priced, creating the economics of a regular service. This new reliability transformed the nature of news itself. For the average person, news had always been a rare and uncertain thing, carried by traveling merchants or pilgrims, often outdated and distorted by the time it arrived. The postal system began to change that rhythm. In commercial hubs like Venice, a new profession arose to feed the hunger for timely information. Writers known as gazettanti compiled handwritten reports on politics, trade, and events from across Europe and the Mediterranean. These sheets, called avici, were copied by teams of scribes and sent out via postal networks to subscribers in other cities, often bankers, merchants, and diplomats who needed the latest intelligence. This was the raw material of early journalism, a commodity bought and sold on paper, creating a regular pulse of information where before there had been only silence punctuated by rumor. The impact on power was immediate and profound. A prince could now correspond regularly with his ambassadors, receiving reports and sending instructions with a predictability that allowed for nuanced, long-distance statecraft. A merchant in Augsburg could receive a paper letter from his agent in Lisbon detailing the price of pepper and send back new orders within a fortnight, managing his business almost in real time. For families separated by trade or duty, letters on paper became fragile threads maintaining connection across leagues, their personal scripts carrying news of daily life and shared experience. This web of paper communication did more than accelerate decisions. It expanded the very sense of community an individual could hold. Your world was no longer bounded solely by the sight of the church spire and the sound of the local market. Through the letters you received and the avici you read, you became aware of a parliament in England, a conflict in Hungary, a new fashion in Paris. It fostered an early consciousness of a wider, interconnected world, a mental map drawn not by cartographers, but by the accumulating lines of handwriting that flowed along the postal routes. The humble letter, often sealed with simple wax, became a quiet engine of modernity, stitching together the fragments of a continent into something that began to resemble a coherent whole. Yet this vast new memory was written on a whisper. The very qualities that made paper revolutionary, its lightness and its affordability, came with a hidden cost, a profound fragility. A clay tablet could survive a fire, emerging from the ashes hardened and legible. A sheet of fine parchment, properly prepared, could endure for 1,000 years in a dry chest. But paper was a child of organic fibers, vulnerable in ways its predecessors were not. A single spark could reduce a library to ash in minutes. Dampness could turn shelves of records into a pulpy, molded mass. Even the air itself held a threat, as the very sizing that gave paper its smooth surface could, over centuries, become acidic, slowly eating away at the fibers from within, turning pages brittle and brown. The medium that democratized knowledge was, in its physical form, heartbreakingly ephemeral. This created a silent crisis of abundance. For the first time, societies were generating more records than they could possibly protect. The administrative paperwork of a small town, the personal ledgers of a merchant, the stacks of pamphlets from a heated debate, these were the heartbeat of the new paper age, yet they were rarely treated as treasures. They were stored in damp basements, packed into unsealed attics, or simply discarded when no longer immediately useful. While institutions might archive formal agreements and preserve important texts, the vast ocean of everyday writing, the documents that reveal how ordinary people lived, worked, and thought, was often left to the mercy of time and neglect. Each loss was a small silence, a gap in the chorus of the past. In response, a new discipline of care slowly emerged. Librarians and archivists, faced with shelves of slowly decaying paper, became conservators. They studied the enemies of their collections. They designed libraries with better ventilation to combat damp. They learned to bind books with alkaline buffers to counteract the coming acid decay. They developed meticulous methods for repairing torn pages using specially prepared papers and wheat starch paste, a quiet art of restoration that aimed to give fragile sheets a second life. This was more than housekeeping. It was a philosophical stance, a recognition that the flood of paper had to be met with deliberate, thoughtful stewardship. The paradox is haunting. The technology that expanded human memory beyond all previous limits is itself a fleeting one. It forces us to ask difficult questions. What conversations, what innovations, what personal stories have vanished because a ledger was thrown away, a letter was lost, or a pamphlet disintegrated? The history written on paper is not the complete story. It is only the story that survived. This fragility makes our choices today all the more significant. Every decision to preserve a family diary, to digitize a town's records, or to support an archive is a vote for which whispers from the paper age will continue to speak to the future. We are left as curators of a legacy written on a substance both powerful and perishable, tasked with ensuring that the light it brought to the world does not flicker and fade. The most profound story paper ever told was the one you wrote about yourself. For centuries, an individual's identity was largely external, defined by their place in a family, a guild, a village, or a church. Your story was told by others, recorded in communal ledgers, or remembered in oral tradition. But with a stack of blank paper and a pen, something quietly revolutionary became possible. You could begin to author your own narrative. This was not about publishing for the world, but about creating a private record of an interior life. The personal diary or journal, once an unimaginable luxury, became a tangible practice for those who could afford the paper. Within its pages, a person could confess doubts, record private triumphs, muse on daily events, or simply note the weather and the price of bread. This act of regular writing was a form of conversation with the self, a practice of introspection that helped crystallize a sense of individual experience separate from the chorus of the community. It allowed someone to see their own life as a sequence of choices and reflections, documented in their own hand. This impulse to document extended outward to define the key moments of a lifetime, creating a paper trail that legally and emotionally framed a person's existence. A birth might be recorded in a parish register, but a marriage was now formalized with a detailed paper contract, often specifying property arrangements and personal provisions. The most forward-looking document of all was the last will and testament. On parchment, a will was a stark legal instrument for the very wealthy. On paper, it became a more accessible tool for a merchant, a farmer, or a shopkeeper to project their wishes beyond their own lifetime. It allowed an individual to direct the future of their hard-earned possessions, to provide for a spouse or children in specific ways, and to make charitable bequests that reflected personal values. This document was a powerful assertion of individual agency, a voice speaking from the page to shape what would come after. Perhaps the most emotionally resonant use of paper was in the preservation of relationships across distance. The personal letter, carried by the new postal systems, became a lifeline. Unlike a formal business missive, these letters were filled with the stuff of daily life, news of a child's first steps, concerns about a parent's health, expressions of loneliness or love, and shared memories. They were often kept tied with ribbon in a drawer, becoming a tangible archive of a relationship's depth. Rereading a letter from a distant spouse or a faraway friend was not just receiving information, it was re-experiencing a connection, seeing the familiar handwriting and hearing the writer's voice in your mind. These bundles of saved correspondence became the first family archives, chronicles of affection and endurance written on fragile sheets. Collectively, these paper practices wove a new kind of identity. You were no longer only who your neighbors said you were also the person revealed in your private journal, the wishes detailed in your will, the emotions poured into your letters, and the signature on your property deed. Paper provided the tools to construct a self that was documented, intentional, and enduring. It created a legal and narrative framework for the modern individual, someone who could own a story as clearly as they owned a piece of land. The journey from desert to empire was also quietly a journey from the communal we to the documented I. The story of paper is not one of uniform progress, but of fascinating divergence. Its journey reveals that a technology, no matter how transformative, is always shaped by the hands that hold it and the society that receives it. Consider its birthplace, China. Here, paper was perfected and woven into the very fabric of a sophisticated civilization for over 1,000 years before it reached the West. It enabled the world's first massive, merit-based imperial bureaucracy, with civil service exams producing a literate class of administrators who managed the empire through a constant flow of paper reports and edicts. It supported a breathtaking literary and artistic culture, with poets and painters celebrating its smooth surface. Yet when printing with movable type emerged in China centuries before Gutenberg, it did not ignite the same kind of social upheaval. One reason lies in the nature of the written language itself. With thousands of unique characters needed for basic literacy, resetting type for a new page was often less efficient than skilled block carving. More importantly, the social structure, centered on a scholarly elite whose status came from mastering a vast canon of classical texts, did not create the same explosive, commercial demand for new ideas that would later emerge in Europe. The technology was brilliant, but the cultural and economic landscape channeled its impact in a different direction. In the Islamic world, paper had been the very engine of the Golden Age, enabling the translation movement and the flourishing of science, philosophy, and medicine. Its knowledge networks stretched from Cordoba to Baghdad, yet in later centuries the trajectory of intellectual inquiry shifted. This was not due to a rejection of paper, which remained in widespread use, but to a complex interplay of factors. Political fragmentation, changes in patterns of patronage for scholarly institutions, and the rising costs of maintaining vast translation and copying infrastructures all played a role. The vibrant, interconnected republic of letters that paper had helped create in the medieval period evolved under different pressures. This highlights a crucial point. A technology can provide a powerful tool, but it cannot guarantee the continuous social and political conditions that maximize its potential for open inquiry. The story here is not of decline, but of a different historical pathway, where paper continued to serve administrative and literary needs within a changing civilizational context. The most poignant divergence, however, occurred an ocean away. In the dense rainforests of Mesoamerica, the Maya had developed their own remarkable writing surface, a flexible paper made from the inner bark of the fig tree. They used it to create codices, screen-folded books filled with intricate glyphs recording their history, astronomy, and ritual knowledge. These were not primitive scrolls, but sophisticated intellectual treasures, the products of a vibrant literary tradition. The arrival of European influence brought a profound rupture. In efforts to reshape local spiritual systems, many of these codices were sought out and destroyed, viewed through a very different cultural lens. Only a handful survived, fragments of a vast written memory that was lost. In this case, the meeting of two worlds did not lead to a fusion of technologies, but to the suppression of one tradition by another. The paper of Europe arrived not as a blank page for exchange, but as part of a system that sought to replace a competing way of recording the world. These parallel stories teach us a sobering and essential lesson. Paper was a catalyst, not a cause. Its power was never inherent in the fibers themselves, but in how different cultures chose to use it, restrict it, or even suppress it. It could uphold a stable imperial order in China, fuel a transnational intellectual revolution in the Islamic world, and then see that revolution change course. It could be the medium for a unique American cosmology, only to be lost in the deep currents of cultural collision. Technology does not march forward on a single, predetermined road. It enters a dance with the deep currents of human society, with its hierarchies, its fears, its ambitions, and its meetings. The humble sheet, therefore, becomes a mirror, reflecting back the priorities and power structures of every civilization it touched. The digital world speaks in the borrowed language of paper. Every time you open a document, send an email, or organize files into folders, you are navigating a landscape built from metaphors of the physical page. Our screens are filled with icons of manila folders, trash bins, and curling page corners, a nostalgic interface for a new kind of memory. The very concept of a file, a discrete packet of information that can be stored, retrieved, and sent, is a direct inheritance from the era of the filing cabinet. The header and footer of a digital report, the footnote link at the bottom of a web page, even the idea of scrolling through a continuous page, all these structures were forged in the world of ink and rag. The Internet did not invent information management. It supercharged a system that paper had spent 1,000 years refining. We built the architecture of our digital minds using the blueprints of the paper age. This invisible legacy runs deeper than icons. The global network of instant communication we rely on today stands upon the physical and social infrastructure that the paper trade created. Consider the pathways. The first regular postal routes, like those of the Thurn and Taxis family, established the principle of scheduled, reliable information delivery across great distances. They created the expectation that a message could travel from one point to another predictably, a conceptual framework that telegraph lines, then fiber optic cables, would later follow. The sprawling bureaucracies of early modern states, which used paper to census populations and manage resources, pioneered the very idea of large-scale, impersonal data management. They developed the procedures, the clerical roles, and the organizational logic that would eventually be encoded into database software and cloud servers. The Internet accelerates this existing flow, but it did not invent the river, and what of our own minds? The cognitive habits we bring to a screen were shaped by centuries of interacting with paper. The act of reading linearly from top to bottom and left to right is a convention solidified by the printed codex. Our comfort with annotating a text, with making marginal notes or highlighting key passages, is a practice born in the margins of parchment and paper manuscripts, now digitized into highlighters and comment boxes. The deep focus required to follow a sustained argument across multiple pages is a mental muscle developed in the quiet company of books. Even our notion of personal archives, of saving letters or treasured writings, has seamlessly transitioned from wooden chests and desk drawers to digital hard drives and cloud storage. We are, in a profound sense, paper-literate beings learning to speak a new, faster dialect. The promise of a paperless society is not a clean break from history, but the latest chapter in this long story. We are not abandoning the concepts paper gave us, we are liberating them from their physical constraints. A single server farm can now hold more text than the great library of Alexandria, but we still organize that text into files and folders. We send billions of emails every day, each one a digital echo of the personal letters that once traveled by coach and sail. this continuity is a powerful reminder. Our most radical new technologies are rarely pure inventions. They are often new containers for very old human behaviors. The trade in paper did more than transform civilization. It built the conceptual and social scaffolding upon which our digital civilization now stands. The page may fade from our desks, but its logic, its order, and its promise of connection are woven into the very code of our modern world. That quiet force continues to shape the world you know. The story of paper is a map of human connection, a chronicle written not by kings but by merchants and scribes. It reveals how a simple innovation, once set loose upon the trade routes of the world, could rewire societies from the ground up. By lowering the cost of a page, it lowered the barrier to entry for ideas. It turned knowledge from a guarded treasure into a circulating currency, enabling the conversations that built our modern mind. It gave administrations the tools to see and manage their people, transforming loose collections of territories into coherent states. It provided the ledger where capital could be tracked and multiplied, fueling the economic engines that would span the globe. And in the privacy of a study, it offered a space for an individual to document their own existence, to claim their story in their own hand. Each receipt in your wallet, each book on your shelf, each sticky note on your desk is a silent node in this ancient network. They are the direct descendants of the sheets that carried the orders of emperors, the calculations of astronomers, and the letters between loved ones. So the next time you hold a piece of paper, feel its texture. You are holding a piece of history, a fragment of the network that taught humanity how to think on a page, collaborate across continents, and build the future one sheet at a time. If this journey has changed how you see the ordinary world around you, let us know your thoughts below. Subscribe to continue exploring the hidden threads that weave our civilization together. And remember, the most enduring empires are often those built not on conquest, but on communication.